I'd been invisible for so long that the cold barely registered anymore. February in Milan had a particular kind of bite, the kind that seeped through cheap polyester uniforms and settled into your bones while you smiled and pretended the marble floors of La Perla Nera weren't freezing through your discount shoes. I was 23 and professionally forgettable, which was exactly what management wanted in a cocktail waitress. Serve the champagne, collect the glasses, dissolve into the wallpaper between the gilt-frame mirrors and crystal chandeliers. The night everything changed started like any other. I balanced a tray of Bellinis through the main salon, weaving between leather sofas where men in suits that cost more than my annual rent discussed things in careful euphemisms. My manager, Stefano, had briefed us that morning with unusual intensity. VIP section fully reserved, absolute discretion, smile but don't speak unless spoken to. The temperature inside La Perla Nera always ran warm, deliberately, I thought, so the women would slip off their furs and the men would order more drinks. But I still felt that February cold in my chest, a tightness that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the numbers in my bank account versus the numbers on my grandmother's medical bills. I just cleared a table near the windows when my phone buzzed in my apron pocket. The screen lit up with my grandmother's neighbor's number. My heart dropped. I glanced at Stefano, saw he was occupied with a complaint at the bar, and slipped toward the service hallway, pressing the phone to my ear. Pronto, I answered, then switched immediately as I heard Signora Morelli's distressed voice. Cos'hai stallo? The Polish came automatically, the language of my childhood, of my grandmother's kitchen and her bedtime stories. What happened? The words tumbled out. Babsha had collapsed, the ambulance had come, they were taking her to the public hospital. I pressed my spine against the cold wall of the hallway, trying to process. Signora Morelli was still talking, something about paperwork and insurance, but I could barely hear her over the rush of blood in my ears. The public hospital meant waiting, meant inadequate care, meant... Elena. I hadn't heard him approach. The voice was quiet, accented in a way I couldn't immediately place, Italian-shaped by something else, something Eastern European underneath. I looked up and forgot how to breathe. He was tall enough that I had to tilt my chin up, dark-haired, dark-eyed, wearing a suit that made everyone else's look like rentals. But it wasn't the expensive tailoring that stopped me. It was the way he looked at me. Not through me, the way customers usually did, but at me, like I'd suddenly become visible in a way I'd never been before in this gilded cage of a restaurant. I realized I was still holding the phone, that Signora Morelli had gone quiet, that I was standing in a service hallway with tears threatening to spill, and this man, this stranger, was watching me with an expression I couldn't read. Polish, he said, and it wasn't a question. Your grandmother. I should have asked how he knew. I should have excused myself, gone back to work, followed every rule in Stefano's handbook. Instead, I nodded. Which hospital? He asked. Something in his tone made me answer. San Carlo, the public ward. His jaw tightened fractionally. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a phone, not the newest model I noticed, but pristine, clearly a business line. He typed something quickly, then looked back at me with those dark, unreadable eyes. Someone will make sure she has a private room and a specialist, he said. Give me your grandmother's name. The words stuck in my throat. Nothing in my life had prepared me for this moment, for this strange mercy from a stranger. Why? Because I can, he said simply. And because you speak Polish like someone who learned it at their grandmother's knee, and that matters to me. He held out his hand for my phone. I gave it to him, watched him type in what looked like a message, then hand it back. On the screen was a number I didn't recognize and a single line, call if there are any problems. M. Thank you, I whispered, and it felt desperately inadequate. Don't thank me yet, he said. His expression shifted into something almost like a smile, but there was no warmth in it, only a kind of dark amusement. Nothing is free, Elena. He knew my name. Of course he did, probably saw it on the staff schedule or heard Stefano bark it across the floor. But hearing it in his voice felt different, felt weighted with something I couldn't identify. "Go," he said, gesturing toward the main salon. "Finish your shift. Your grandmother is in good hands now." I wanted to ask who he was, how he could make such promises, what he would want in return. But Stefano appeared at the end of the hallway, his face reddening when he saw me talking to a guest, and survival instinct kicked in. I straightened my shoulders, smoothed my uniform, and walked back into the golden light of La Perla. I didn't see the dark-eyed stranger again that night, but I felt his gaze following me between the tables, heavy as a hand on my spine. At 2 in the morning, when I finally hung up my apron and collected my coat from the staff room, Stefano called me into his office. His expression was thunderous. "You're fired," he said flatly. "Effective immediately. You left your post, you took a personal call on the floor, and you—" He paused, and something like fear flickered across his face. "You bothered one of our most important guests." The world tilted. "I didn't," he spoke to me. "I don't care, you're done. Leave your uniform and get out." I stood there in my street clothes, jeans and a sweater that had seen better winters, holding the polyester uniform I just stripped off, trying to process the fact that I just lost my income at the exact moment my grandmother needed me most. The irony was so sharp it cut. The February night hit me like a slap when I stepped outside. The streets were empty except for a few taxis and the occasional night worker heading home. I pulled my coat tighter and started walking toward the metro, my mind already cycling through impossible calculations. Rent, bills, medical costs. I had maybe 3 weeks of savings if I stretched them, maybe 4 if I stopped eating. A car pulled up beside me, smooth and silent and black as the night itself. The back window rolled down. "Get in, Alina," said that voice, the one that had somehow rearranged my entire evening with a few quiet words. I should have kept walking. Every instinct I'd honed growing up in a neighborhood where strange cars and stranger offers were things you ran from told me to keep moving. But I thought of my grandmother in a hospital bed, of the private room he'd promised, of the debt I'd already incurred without understanding its price. I got in. The interior of the car was warm and smelled of leather, and something else. Cologne, expensive and subtle, with notes of cedar and something darker, almost smoky. He sat in the far corner of the back seat, enough space between us to be respectful, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body in the climate-controlled air. "You were fired," he said. "It wasn't a question." "How did you—" I started, then stopped. Of course he knew. Men like him always knew. "Stefano is protective of his establishment. He saw you speaking with me and assumed the worst." He paused, and in the dim light from the passing street lamps, I caught the edge of something like amusement in his expression. He was not entirely wrong. The driver said nothing, eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel. I had the sense of being in a bubble, separate from the city sliding past the tinted windows. "I don't understand," I said, because it was true and because the silence was pressing against my chest. "You speak Polish fluently. You also speak Italian without an accent, which means you've been here long enough to lose the edges. That combination is valuable." He shifted slightly, and I caught the full force of his attention. "I have business interests that require someone who can navigate both worlds, someone who understands discretion." "I'm a waitress," I said. "I carry drinks." "You were a waitress. Now you're unemployed and your grandmother is in a hospital where I've ensured she'll receive excellent care." His voice was matter-of-fact, no threat in it, just the presentation of facts. "I'm offering you a different position, temporary, well compensated. You'd work as a translator and assistant for approximately 3 months." "Doing what exactly?" "Attending meetings, translating documents, ensuring that communications are accurate and discreet." He pulled a thin folder from beside him and handed it to me. The details are here, including the salary. Look it over. If you're interested, there's a phone number on the last page." I opened the folder. The street lamps gave just enough light to see the first figure. My heart stuttered. 3 months at that rate would cover a year of my grandmother's care, maybe more. "And if I say no?" "Then you say no. Your grandmother's care won't change. Consider that a separate matter." He said it so smoothly I almost believed him. Almost. "But you'll need to find another job quickly, and Milan is not kind to waitresses with gaps in their employment history." The car slowed, and I realized we'd reached my neighborhood, the shabby district of converted factories and immigrant families where rent was almost affordable and the metro station had bars on the windows. He'd known where I lived. Of course he had. "Think about it," he said as the driver opened my door. "You have until tomorrow evening." I stepped out onto the cracked sidewalk, clutching the folder against my chest. The car pulled away, smooth and silent, leaving me standing in the cold with more questions than answers, and a number I knew I would call. I didn't sleep. I sat at my grandmother's kitchen table in our tiny apartment. She'd been living with me since her pension couldn't cover both rent and medication, and read the contract 3 times. The terms were clear. 3 months, translator and personal assistant, discretion absolutely required, compensation deposited weekly, termination clause available to both parties with 1 week's notice. It looked legitimate, professional. Except for the part where it didn't specify exactly what kind of business required a Polish-Italian translator who'd been plucked from a restaurant floor. At dawn, I called the hospital. The nurse who answered sounded confused when I asked about my grandmother, then put me on hold. When she came back, her tone had changed entirely. "Signora Kowalska is in the private wing," she said carefully. "She's resting comfortably. Dr. Marchetti is overseeing her care personally." Dr. Marchetti. I'd heard that name before, Switzerland trained, one of the best cardiologists in Europe, definitely not someone who worked the public wards. "Can I visit?" I asked. "Of course. She's in room 312. Visiting hours are flexible for private patients." I dressed in my one good outfit, black trousers and a cream blouse I saved for job interviews I never got, and took the metro to the hospital. The private wing was a different world. Quiet hallways with art on the walls, soft lighting, nurses who smiled instead of rushed past. My grandmother was awake when I slipped into her room, propped up against pillows that looked infinitely more comfortable than the standard issue. "Kachini," she said softly, "sweetheart." Her voice was weak but steady. Such a fuss over an old woman. I took her hand, felt the papery skin and the bones too close to the surface. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been given a gift I don't deserve." Her eyes, still sharp despite her age, fixed on me. "The doctor was here. He says I'll need medication monitoring, but that I can manage at home with the right support. He says someone has arranged everything." "Someone did," I said carefully. "And what will this someone want in return?" I wanted to lie, to tell her it was charity or a mistake or anything that wouldn't make her worry. But Babsha had survived too much. The old country, migration, my mother's death, to accept comfortable fictions. "A job," I told her. 3 months of work, translation and assistance." "What kind of work requires such generosity up front?" "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out." She studied my face with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read people as a survival skill. "Be careful, Alina. Men who have such power rarely use it without purpose." "I know. But you'll do it anyway, because of me." "I'll do it because we need this," I corrected gently. "And because maybe, just this once, something good can come from a strange night." She squeezed my hand, and I saw the fear underneath her acceptance. We both knew I was walking into something I didn't fully understand. But when you're standing at the edge of a cliff with nowhere else to go, sometimes you have to trust the hand reaching back to pull you up, even if you can't see who's holding it. That evening, I called the number from the folder. He answered on the second ring, Alina. Just my name, but the way he said it made my spine straighten. I'll take the position. Good, a car will collect you tomorrow morning at 8. Bring a valid passport and pack for 3 days. We'll arrange the rest. Wait, where are we going? Does it matter? There was something almost playful in his tone, but with an edge that suggested the question was a test. I thought of my grandmother in that comfortable room, of Dr. Marchetti and his Swiss credentials, of the way the dark-eyed stranger had known exactly where I lived and exactly what I needed. No, I said, surprising myself with how steady I sounded. It doesn't matter. Then I'll see you tomorrow, Alina. He paused, and I heard something shift in his voice, something almost warm. And Alina, thank you. The line went dead before I could ask what he was thanking me for. The car arrived at precisely 8 o'clock, the same black vehicle from the night before. The driver was different, older, with the weathered face of someone who'd seen everything and judged nothing, but the interior was exactly as I remembered. Leather, cedar, that subtle smoky undertone that I now associated with decisions that couldn't be unmade. We drove for 20 minutes through Milan's morning traffic before pulling into an underground garage beneath a building I recognized from the skyline, but had never entered. Glass and steel, and the kind of architectural confidence that came from having nothing to prove. The elevator required a key card, which the driver produced without comment, and we rose in silence to the 40th floor. The doors opened onto a reception area that managed to be both minimalist and luxurious. All clean lines and expensive materials, nothing that screamed wealth but everything that whispered it. A woman in an impeccable gray suit looked up from her desk, smiled with professional warmth, and gestured toward a door to her left. "Signor Volkov is expecting you," she said in perfect Italian. Volkov, so now I had a name to go with the dark eyes and quiet power. The door opened before I could knock, and there he was, dressed more casually than I'd seen him before, charcoal sweater and dark trousers, but somehow no less intimidating. If anything, the lack of formal armor made him more present, more real. "Alina," he said, stepping back to let me enter. "On time, I appreciate that." The office was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of Milan spreading out below like a promise or a threat. There was a desk, dark wood, very old, clearly not chosen for fashion. But he led me instead to a seating area by the windows, 2 leather chairs and a low table where someone had laid out coffee and pastries. "Sit," he said, and it wasn't quite a command, more an invitation that expected acceptance. "We should talk before we leave." "Leave for where?" "Geneva first, then Zurich, possibly Vienna, depending on how the meetings go." He poured coffee with the ease of someone comfortable with service despite his obvious authority. "You'll need to be prepared for formal dinners, business meetings, some social events. Did you bring your passport?" I handed it over, watched him flip through it with the practiced eye of someone who'd crossed a lot of borders. "Your visa is fine for Switzerland and Austria. We'll be back within a week." The contract said 3 months. "It does, but we'll spend most of that time in Milan with occasional travel. I wanted to assess your comfort level with movement before committing to longer trips." He handed back my passport and fixed me with that unreadable gaze. "Any concerns?" "About 100, starting with the fact that I still didn't know exactly what his business was, or why it required a translator who could be pulled from a restaurant floor with a few phone calls and a medical miracle. But I thought of my grandmother sleeping peacefully in her private room and heard myself say, "No concerns." "Liar," he said, but there was amusement in it. "But a polite one which I appreciate. Let me clarify some things. First, my name is Maxim Volkov. I have business interests throughout Europe, primarily in logistics and import-export. Some of my partners prefer to conduct business in Polish, others in Italian, and I need someone who can navigate both with complete accuracy." "Logistics," I repeated, thinking of every crime movie I'd ever seen, and the ways legitimate businesses could become fronts for less legitimate activities. Logistics, he confirmed, and his expression suggested he knew exactly what I was thinking. I won't lie to you, Alina. Some of my associates exist in moral gray areas. I need you to translate what they say accurately and discreetly, not to judge their business practices. Can you do that? The question hung between us, heavy with implication. This was my exit point, the moment where I could stand up, apologize, and walk back to my uncertain life with at least my conscience intact. But conscience didn't pay for Swiss cardiologists, and moral gray areas were relative when you'd grown up watching your mother work 3 jobs and still fall short. Yes, I said, I can do that. Good. He leaned back in his chair, and for the first time I saw something like satisfaction cross his face. A few rules before we proceed. 1. You don't discuss my business with anyone outside this office ever. 2. In public settings, you're my assistant and translator, nothing more. 3. If you feel unsafe or uncomfortable, you tell me immediately. 4. You maintain separate accounts and finances. This is a professional arrangement, not charity, and I won't have you feeling beholden beyond the terms of our contract. The last rule surprised me enough that I blinked. That's unusual. I know what it looks like when someone has leverage, he said quietly. I prefer clean transactions and clear terms. You work, I pay, your grandmother receives care. No confusion about debts or obligations. Agreed. Agreed. Then we leave in an hour. Clara will help you with anything you need. He stood, signaling the conversation's end, but paused before opening the door. And Alina, welcome to the team. I have a feeling you're going to be very valuable. I didn't know whether that was a promise or a warning. The private jet waiting at Linate Airport answered a lot of my unspoken questions about exactly how extensive Maxim Volkov's business interests were. Small enough to be discreet, large enough to suggest serious capital, configured more for meetings than luxury, with a conference table that could seat 6 and several privacy screens that could divide the cabin into separate spaces. Maxim worked for the first hour of the flight, laptop open, phone occasionally buzzing with messages he'd read and answer with swift efficiency. I sat across from him, trying not to feel like an imposter in borrowed designer clothes. Clara had taken one look at my 3 days of packing and gently suggested I borrow from a selection she kept for emergencies, which apparently included assistants who showed up with department store basics. Tell me about your grandmother, Maxim said suddenly, closing his laptop and giving me his full attention in that unsettling way he had. What do you want to know? Whatever you're comfortable sharing. I find that understanding someone's context helps avoid misunderstandings. I thought about deflecting, keeping it professional and surface level, but something in his expression, genuine curiosity without the predatory edge I'd learned to recognize, made me answer honestly. She raised me after my mother died, taught me Polish because she was afraid I'd forget where I came from, worked cleaning houses until her health failed, then lived on a pension that couldn't cover food and medication both. I met his eyes. She's the best person I know, and she deserves better than what I've been able to give her. And now she has better, Maxim said, because of you. Because of you, I corrected. Because of us, he said, and there was something final in the way he said it, like he was drawing a line that couldn't be erased. The care she's receiving isn't charity, Alina. It's an investment in someone I value. Don't discount your own worth. Before I could respond, his phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen and something changed in his expression. Not fear exactly, but a sharpening, like a blade being drawn from a sheath. We may have a situation in Geneva, he said, more to himself than to me. One of my associates is being difficult about terms. I may need you to translate some uncomfortable conversations. How uncomfortable? The kind where people say things in one language they wouldn't want overheard in another. He looked at me steadily. If at any point you want to leave the room, you can. I won't hold it against you. But it would look weak, I said, understanding the subtext. Yes, which is why I'm giving you the option now before we land. Once we're in that room, you'll need to be unshakable. Can you do that? I thought of my grandmother asking me to be careful, of the warnings I hadn't heeded, of the strange mercy that had led me onto this jet heading toward meetings I didn't fully understand. Yes, I said and meant it. The landing in Geneva was smooth, the drive to the hotel even smoother. We checked into a suite at the Beau Rivage, separate bedrooms connected by a shared living space, and Maxim disappeared into his room to make phone calls while I stood by the window and watched the lake spread out like hammered silver under the afternoon sun. Clara had packed me a midnight blue dress and heels I'd never have chosen for myself, too elegant, too noticeable, but when I put them on, I understood. This was armor, the kind that made you look like you belonged in rooms where deals were brokered and power changed hands. Maxim knocked once, then entered when I called out. He was in a suit again, dark and perfectly tailored, and his eyes did a quick sweep of my appearance before nodding once in approval. "You clean up well," he said, which might have been an insult from anyone else but somehow felt like a compliment. "Ready." "Ready." The dinner was held in a private room at a restaurant that didn't have prices on the menu, which always meant they were astronomical. 6 men around a table, all of them older than Maxim, all of them watching him with the careful attention of people who'd learned not to underestimate youth when it came with reputation. They spoke in Italian mostly, discussing shipping schedules and port logistics with the kind of detail that suggested legitimate business. I translated the few Polish comments that cropped up, kept my face neutral, noticed the way Maxim's hand would occasionally rest on the table near mine, close enough to be protective, not close enough to be possessive. Then the conversation shifted. One of the men, gray-haired, expensive watch, eyes like flint, leaned back in his chair and said something in rapid Polish that made the others at the table pause. "He's saying," I translated quietly, keeping my voice even, "that your shipment last month was light by 15%, and he's wondering if you're trying to renegotiate terms after the fact." Maxim's expression didn't change. Tell him the shipment was exactly as contracted. If his receiving team reported otherwise, he has an internal problem, not a negotiation issue. I translated. The gray-haired man's face darkened. He replied in Polish, faster this time, more aggressive. "He's saying you're calling him a liar, that his reputation doesn't survive questions like that." I kept my tone neutral, but under the table I felt my hands curl into fists. The temperature in the room had dropped several degrees. "Tell him," Maxim said, still calm, "that I'm calling his receiving team incompetent or corrupt, which is his problem to solve. But if he'd like to review the manifests together, I have copies that were signed by his own people. We can examine them now, or he can accept that the contract was fulfilled as written." The translation hung in the air between them. I watched the gray-haired man calculate, saw the moment he decided Maxim wasn't bluffing. His expression shifted from aggression to cold assessment. "He says he'll review internally," I translated as the man spoke again, this time with less heat, "and he apologizes for the misunderstanding." "Tell him I appreciate his diligence," Maxim said, and there was steel underneath the courtesy, "and that I look forward to continued business once he's resolved his internal matters." The rest of the dinner proceeded smoothly, talk turning to safer topics, markets, politics, the weather. But I felt the shift, understood that I just witnessed something important. Maxim hadn't threatened, hadn't raised his voice, but he'd drawn a line and made the other man back down. Power without posturing, precision without cruelty. Later, back at the hotel, I stood on the balcony and let the Swiss night air clear my head. I heard the door open behind me, felt Maxim's presence before he spoke. "You did well tonight," he said, coming to stand beside me at the railing. "Most people fold when the temperature drops like that. You stayed steady. I've seen worse, I said, which was true. Growing up poor taught you to recognize danger in all its forms, and tonight had been uncomfortable but not actively threatening. Still, thank you. He was quiet for a moment, and I felt his gaze on my profile. Did you understand what was actually happening in there? A test, I said. He was testing whether you'd fold under pressure, whether I was a liability or an asset. You showed I was the latter. Smart. There was approval in his voice. You're going to do fine in this world, Alina. I turned to look at him, found him closer than I'd expected, near enough that I could see the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw, smell that cedar and smoke scent that seemed to cling to him like a signature. What world is that exactly? I asked. His smile was slight, enigmatic, one where the rules are different but honor still matters, where loyalty is currency and weakness is unforgivable, where people like us, he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, where people like us take care of our own. I'm not one of yours, I said, though it came out less certain than I meant it. Not yet, he agreed, but you could be. He left me there with the night, and the lake and the growing certainty that I'd stepped onto a path that wouldn't let me turn back, even if I wanted to. Zurich was business. Vienna was almost pleasure. Maxim had meetings in both cities, but he also seemed determined to show me that his world contained more than conference rooms and tense negotiations. We went to a concert at the Musikverein, where the acoustics made me want to cry, had dinner at a restaurant where the chef came out personally to discuss the menu with Maxim in German. I couldn't follow but gathered was respectful bordering on reverent. You speak German too, I observed when the chef left. Russian, Italian, German, English, enough Polish to get by, he confirmed. My father believed in preparation. Languages open doors. It was the first time he'd mentioned his father. I filed it away, added it to the growing collection of puzzle pieces I was assembling about Maxim Volkov and his empire built on logistics and careful leverage. We were walking back to the hotel through streets that belonged in a fairy tale, old buildings and cobblestones and windows glowing warm against the spring night, when he took my hand, just slipped his fingers between mine as naturally as if we'd been doing it for years. I should have pulled away, should have reminded him about professional boundaries and the terms of our very clear contract. But his hand was warm and the night was beautiful, and I'd been invisible for so long that being seen, being held, even in this small way, felt like oxygen after years underwater. Alina, he said softly, and I heard the question in my name. Don't, I said, but I didn't let go of his hand. Don't complicate this. Too late. He stopped walking, turned to face me fully. It was complicated the moment you answered your phone in Polish, and I realized you were exactly what I needed. I'm your employee. You're more than that, and we both know it. His free hand came up to cup my cheek, thumb brushing my cheekbone with devastating gentleness. But I won't push. I'm a patient man, Alina, and you're worth waiting for. He kissed my forehead, chaste, almost brotherly, and released me. We walked the rest of the way in silence, but everything had shifted. The air between us felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. That night, lying in my hotel room with the sounds of Vienna humming outside, I let myself acknowledge what I'd been trying to ignore. I was falling for Maxim Volkov, falling for his quiet competence and his careful courtesy, for the way he wielded power without cruelty and protected what he considered his with ruthless efficiency. It was dangerous and possibly stupid and completely unavoidable. My phone buzzed with a text from Maxim's number. Thank you for tonight, sleep well. I didn't respond. Couldn't, because anything I said would either be a lie or a confession I wasn't ready to make. We returned to Milan on a Tuesday, and I spent the next 2 weeks settling into a routine that felt almost normal. Mornings with my grandmother, who was recovering beautifully under Dr. Marchetti's care. Afternoons at Maxim's office, translating documents and sitting in on meetings that covered everything from shipping manifests to real estate acquisitions. Evenings sometimes alone, sometimes at dinners with Maxim's associates, where I played my role as the competent, invisible assistant who heard everything and said nothing. Clara became something like a friend, teaching me the unwritten rules of Maxim's world, which associates could be trusted, which required careful watching, how to read the subtle shifts in his expression that indicated approval or concern. She'd worked for him for 5 years, she told me, and he'd never once broken his word or failed to protect his people. "He's a good man in a difficult business," she said one afternoon while I was organizing files in the outer office. "Don't let the surface fool you." "What surface?" I asked. She gave me a look that suggested I wasn't fooling anyone. "The one where he pretends he doesn't care. He cares, Alina, deeply, and he's chosen to care about you, which is both a gift and a burden." Before I could ask what she meant, Maxim's office door opened and he emerged looking troubled. "Alina, I need you to come with me," he said without preamble. "Now." The urgency in his voice got me moving. I grabbed my jacket and followed him to the elevator, to the car waiting in the underground garage, to a drive that took us not to his usual meeting spots, but to a neighborhood I recognized with a jolt. My grandmother's old district, the place where she'd lived before moving in with me. We pulled up in front of the building, and Maxim was out of the car before the driver had fully stopped. I followed, confused and increasingly worried, up the stairs to the third floor where my grandmother's apartment had been. The door was open. Inside, furniture had been removed, walls freshly painted, everything clean and bright and transformed. My grandmother sat in a chair by the window, her chair, the one piece of furniture that remained, and smiled when she saw me. "Kachani," she said, "come see what this kind man has done." I turned to Maxim, who stood in the doorway watching my reaction with carefully banked intensity. "She can't live in your apartment forever," he said quietly. "It's too small, too many stairs. This place has an elevator, better light, a nurse can visit daily. And it's hers. I bought the apartment outright, put it in her name. No rent, no lease, just home." The tears came before I could stop them. I pressed my hands to my face, trying to contain the overwhelming rush of gratitude and fear, and something else I didn't want to name. "Why?" I managed to ask. "Because I can," he said, echoing his words from that first night. "And because she matters to you, which means she matters to me." My grandmother was watching us with knowing eyes, and I saw her smile slightly before she turned her attention back to the window. She'd read the situation perfectly, understood what I was still trying to deny. Maxim stepped closer, voice dropping so only I could hear. "This isn't leverage, Alina. This isn't a debt. This is me taking care of what's mine." "I'm not yours," I said, but it came out weak. "Not yet," he said again, and this time when his hand found the small of my back, protective, possessive, I didn't pull away. The gala was his idea, one of Milan's premier cultural events, a fundraiser for the opera house where the city's elite gathered to be seen and make deals under cover of charitable intentions. Maxim needed to be there, which meant I needed to be there, and Clara had already arranged for a dress that made the midnight blue number from Geneva look casual. It was crimson silk, backless, cut to suggest rather than reveal. I felt exposed and powerful in equal measure when I put it on, and the look on Maxim's face when I emerged from the bedroom confirmed what I'd suspected. This night was about more than business. "You're trying to kill me," he said, voice rough. "Technically, Clara chose it. Remind me to give her a raise." His eyes tracked down and up, and I felt the heat of his gaze like a physical touch. "Or possibly fire her for her poor judgment in making my assistant look like temptation incarnate." "I thought this was a professional arrangement," I said, echoing his words from weeks ago. "It is. Professionally, I need you on my arm tonight so every man in that room knows you're under my protection. Personally, he stepped closer, and I caught cedar and smoke and something warmer. Personally, I need them to know you're mine. Maxim. Not yet, he said for the third time, but now it felt like a promise. But soon, Alina, soon. The gala was everything I'd imagined. Chandeliers and champagne and women in jewels that cost more than I'd make in a lifetime. Maxim kept me close, his hand on my back a constant presence, and I understood the choreography perfectly. This was a performance, a message to everyone watching. She's protected, she's valued, she's not available. We made it through the cocktail hour, and most of dinner before the trouble arrived. He was older, silver-haired, wearing confidence and cruelty in equal measure. I'd seen him once before in photographs Clara had shown me. Dmitry Volkov, distant cousin, rival in business, the man who'd been trying to undercut Maxim's operations for years. He approached our table with a predator's grace, smile wide and empty. "Maxim," he said in Russian, which I didn't speak but could tell from context was not complimentary. "I see you've found a new pet. How long before this one learns the truth about you?" Maxim's expression didn't change, but I felt his hand press slightly harder against my spine, a signal, a warning. "Dmitri, I didn't realize they'd lowered the entry standards for this event." The older man's smile sharpened. He switched to Italian, including me in the conversation. "And who is this lovely creature? Let me guess, translator, assistant, or have you upgraded to something more personal?" "Careful," Maxim said softly, and there was death in that single word. "I'm simply wondering if she knows what she's gotten herself into. The Volkov family business isn't for the faint of heart." Dmitri's gaze fixed on me, calculating. "Tell me, dear, has he mentioned our grandfather, the empire built on?" "That's enough." Maxim stood smoothly, and suddenly the temperature in our corner of the room dropped 20 degrees. "Elena, would you excuse us? I need to have a private conversation with my cousin." I started to stand, but Dmitri laughed. "No, let her stay. She should know who she's working for. Maxim likes to play the gentleman, but our family made its fortune in." "Leave," Maxim said to me, voice hard. "Now." I went, but not far. Stood near the bar where I could watch the two men face off, Maxim's posture radiating controlled violence, Dmitri still smiling that empty smile. They spoke in rapid Russian, and I saw the moment Maxim said something that made Dmitri's expression falter. Then the room erupted in controlled chaos. Men in suits, police, but not quite entered through the main doors. Financial regulators, I'd later learn, armed with warrants and badges and the kind of authority that made even powerful men nervous. Dmitri's smile turned genuine, and I understood. He'd arranged this, timed it perfectly to embarrass Maxim in front of everyone who mattered. Maxim caught my eye across the room, and his expression was apologetic and fierce all at once. He mouthed one word, "Go." I went, out through the service entrance into the night, into the car that pulled up with Clara's face in the window. "Get in," she said urgently. "We need to move fast." The safe house was 40 minutes outside Milan, tucked into hills covered in early spring green. I changed in the car into clothes Clara had waiting, jeans, sweater, nothing that screamed evening gala, and now sat in a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a country home catalog while Clara made coffee with steady hands. "He'll be fine," she said, reading my face. "This isn't his first time dealing with Dmitri's games. The financial police won't find anything because there's nothing to find, at least, nothing that can be proven. Maxim keeps his operations clean, technically legal if morally flexible." "What does that mean?" She sat across from me, slid a mug of coffee into my hands. "It means he imports and exports goods that exist in legal gray areas. Nothing explicitly illegal, nothing that violates sanctions or trade agreements, but things that other people prefer to keep quiet. Art with uncertain provenance. Luxury goods that technically have correct paperwork but suspicious origins. He facilitates movement without getting his hands directly dirty. That's still, yes, but it's also how the world actually works, Elena. The legitimate and illegitimate economies aren't separate, they're intertwined. Maxim navigates both, and he does it better than most because he understands where the lines are and how not to cross them. My phone buzzed. Maxim's number, but the message was from someone else. He's clear, coming to you. Victor. Victor, I'd learned, was Maxim's head of security, a man who looked like he'd been carved from stone and spoke only when absolutely necessary. See, Clara said, told you he'd be fine. But I couldn't shake the image of Dimitri's smile, the satisfaction in his eyes when the regulators arrived. This was only the opening move in whatever game the cousins were playing, and I was suddenly very aware that I'd become a piece on the board. Maxim arrived an hour later, still in his tux but with his tie undone and exhaustion written in the lines around his eyes. He stopped when he saw me, and something in his expression softened. "You're here," he said, like he'd been worried I wouldn't be. Where else would I be? Smart enough to run. He crossed to me, pulled me into his arms without asking permission, and I let him. Felt his heart racing against my cheek, felt the tremor in his hands that suggested the evening had cost him more than he'd admit. "Thank you for staying." "I signed a 3-month contract," I said against his shirt. "Still have 6 weeks left." His laugh was rough. "Ah yes, the contract, how could I forget?" He pulled back enough to look down at me, and the intensity in his gaze made my breath catch. "Elena." "Don't," I said, but without conviction. "Don't say something we'll both regret." "I regret nothing where you're concerned." His hand came up to cup my face, thumb tracing my cheekbone. "But you're right. This isn't the time. When I tell you what you've become to me, it won't be when I'm running from my cousin's machinations and you're here because you have nowhere else to go." "Then when?" "When you're ready to hear it, and when I can offer you something other than complications." He kissed my forehead, gentle and devastating. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we need to make plans." He left me there with Clara, who was watching with knowing eyes and a slight smile. "He's never looked at anyone the way he looks at you," she said quietly. "Just so you know." I didn't know what to do with that information, so I filed it away with all the other dangerous truths accumulating in my chest. Morning brought clarity and strategy. Maxim gathered his core team, Clara, Victor, a lawyer named Stefania with sharp eyes and sharper suits, and me, around the kitchen table and laid out the situation. "Dimitri is escalating," he said without preamble. "Last night was theater, but the message was clear. He's coming after everything I've built, and he's willing to use official channels as weapons. The financial police found nothing because there was nothing to find, but the investigation will continue, which means scrutiny on all our operations." "What does that mean for us?" Stefania asked. "It means we shift strategy. Everything moves toward legitimacy, starting now. No more gray areas, no more flexible interpretations. We take the short-term loss to secure the long-term position." He looked at each of us in turn. "It also means Dimitri will escalate further. He knows I won't engage in an open war, too costly, too messy, so he'll look for softer targets." His gaze landed on me, and I understood before he said it. "You're a potential vulnerability," he said carefully. "Not because you've done anything wrong, but because he knows you matter to me. We need to adjust accordingly." "What does that mean?" My voice was steadier than I felt. "It means you and your grandmother move here to this safe house until we resolve the situation. It means Victor assigns security, discreet but present. It means we're careful about public appearances and communications." He paused. "And it means you need to decide if you want to stay in this mess or if you prefer to exit while you still can." "The contract," I started. "Fuck the contract," he said bluntly, surprising me. "I won't hold you to it if the situation has become untenable. Your grandmother's care continues regardless. The apartment stays in her name, and you walk away with 3 months' salary and a reference that will get you any legitimate job you want. No penalties, no recriminations. It was the out I'd been subconsciously waiting for, the exit ramp clearly marked and easy to take. But I thought of Dimitri's smile, of Maxim's expression when he'd found me here last night, of the way he'd said mine, like it was both a claim and a promise. "I'm staying," I said. "Elena, I'm staying. You said loyalty is currency in your world. Consider this my investment." Something blazed in his eyes, fierce and possessive and almost frightening in its intensity. "You're sure?" "No," I admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway." "Then we protect you properly." He turned to Victor. "Full security detail, standard protocols, and coordinate with the grandmother's nursing care so they're aware of the situation." "The grandmother has a name," I interjected. "Maria, and she'll want an explanation for why we're suddenly hiding in the countryside." "Tell her the truth," Maxim said simply. "That I have business complications and I need to keep you both safe while I resolve them. She'll understand. She's lived enough life to know how these things work." He was right. When I called Babsha an hour later to explain the situation, her response was pragmatic bordering on fatalistic. "So your nice employer has enemies," she said in Polish. "And these enemies might use you to hurt him. This is not surprising. You're not worried." "Kachini, I survived the old country, the migration, your mother's death. I learned that worry changes nothing." But she paused, and I heard the weight behind her words. "Be certain this man is worth the risk. Not all chains are beautiful, Elena, even when they're made of gold." "I know." "Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, you're falling in love with him, and love makes us stupid. Brave, but stupid." She wasn't wrong. I was falling, had fallen, and the landing was going to hurt no matter how it ended. But I'd already made my choice, and I wasn't the kind of person who backed down once I'd committed. "I'll be careful," I promised. "Good. Now send this employer of yours to visit me. I want to look him in the eye and tell him what happens if my granddaughter gets hurt." I smiled despite everything. "I'll pass that message along." When I told Maxim about Babsha's summons, his expression shifted into something almost like nervousness. "Your grandmother wants to threaten me?" he asked. "She wants to assess you. There's a difference." Not much of one, but he was already reaching for his jacket. "Let's go. I'd rather face Dimitri than an angry Polish grandmother, but at least she might respect directness." The visit was exactly as uncomfortable as I'd anticipated. Babsha sat in her chair by the window, now moved to the safe house at Maxim's insistence, and studied him with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read people as a survival skill. Maxim, to his credit, didn't flinch. Sat across from her, hands relaxed on his knees, and met her gaze steadily. "You've put my granddaughter in danger," she said in Polish, which I translated even though I suspected Maxim understood more than he'd let on. "Yes," he said simply. "That wasn't my intention, but intentions don't change facts. She's in danger because she matters to me, and my enemies will try to use that." "And what will you do about it?" "Everything necessary. Security, relocation if needed, whatever it takes to keep her safe." But he paused, choosing his words carefully. "I won't lie to you. My world contains risk. It always will. Elena knows this, and she's chosen to stay anyway. I can promise to protect her, but I can't promise the danger will disappear." Babsha was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something in Polish that made me blink. "What did she say?" Maxim asked, looking at me. "She said," I hesitated, not sure I'd heard correctly. "She said you remind her of someone she knew in the old country before she came to Italy." "Who?" Babsha answered in halting Italian, and I felt the world tilt. "Your father, Alexei Volkov. He helped my husband and me when we needed papers to leave. I never forgot his kindness or the price he must have paid for helping people like us. Maxim had gone very still. You knew my father. Not well, but I knew of him. Knew he walked the same line you walk between legitimate and necessary, between law and loyalty. She leaned forward, eyes bright with unshed tears. He died too young, I heard, before he could see his work bear fruit. He died in a car accident, Maxim said tightly. When I was 17, or that's what the official report said. And unofficially, Dimitri's father arranged it, a power play disguised as tragedy. The words came out flat, emotionless, but I heard the old pain underneath. I've been playing the long game ever since, building toward the moment I can return the favor. And Alina is part of this game. Babsha's voice had sharpened. No, Maxim looked at me and the masks fell away entirely. Alina is what I'm building toward, the life after vengeance if such a thing exists. He stopped, seemed to wrestle with vulnerability. She's the first thing in 10 years that matters more than the plan. The silence in the room was profound. I felt tears tracking down my cheeks and didn't wipe them away. Then I will tell you what I told my husband when he wanted to involve himself in dangerous matters, Babsha said finally. If you love her, truly love her, then you give her the choice to walk away. Not once, but every day. And you respect whatever she chooses, even if it breaks your heart. I will, Maxim said, and it sounded like an oath. Good, Babsha settled back in her chair, satisfied. Then you have my blessing for whatever that's worth. Now leave us. I want to talk to my granddaughter alone. Maxim left, closing the door gently behind him. Babsha waited until his footsteps faded before speaking. You love him, she said, not a question. Yes. And you understand what that means, the life you're choosing. I think so, maybe not all of it, but enough. Then I'll tell you something I never told anyone, not even your mother. She took my hand and hers felt paper-thin and infinitely strong. Your grandfather and I, we had debts to Alexei Volkov. Real debts, the kind that couldn't be repaid with money. When we left the old country, we left owing him our lives. I always wondered if we'd be called to pay that debt someday. Babsha. Listen, debt can become choice, Alina. It starts as obligation but transforms into something else if you're lucky. I chose to honor Alexei's memory by building a good life, by raising your mother right, by teaching you the values he believed in. Now you have the chance to make the same choice with his son, not because you owe him, but because you want to. How do I know the difference? You'll know, she said simply. Because obligation feels like chains, while choice feels like wings, even when the destination is the same. That night, Maxim and I sat on the terrace of the safe house, watching the stars emerge over the hills. The spring air was cool but not cold, carrying the scent of grass and possibility. Your grandmother is terrifying, he said finally. She likes you. How can you tell? She threatened to haunt me if I hurt you. That's how she shows affection. I leaned my head against his shoulder, felt him tense and then relax. She told me about your father, about the debt. There is no debt, he said immediately, fiercely. Whatever my father did for your grandparents, that's separate from us. I don't want you here out of obligation, Alina. I know, she said the same thing. I turned to look up at him, found him already watching me with that intensity that made my chest tight. But maybe there's something to the idea that debt can become choice, that we can honor the past while building something new. What are you saying? I'm saying, I took a breath, gathered my courage. I'm saying that I'm in this, not because of contracts or gratitude or even because you've helped my grandmother. I'm in this because of you, because of who you are when the masks come off, because you're trying to build something better than what you inherited, and I want to help. His hand came up to cup my face, and his expression was so raw it hurt to look at. You're my weakness, Alina. Dimitri knows it, everyone knows it. You make me vulnerable in ways I can't afford. Then we'll be vulnerable together, I said, and we'll be stronger for it. He kissed me then, not gentle like before but desperate, claiming, like he was trying to pull me into his chest and keep me there forever. I kissed him back with everything I had, all the fear and want and impossible hope that had been building since that first night in the freezing cold outside La Perlanera. When we finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine. "I won't let him hurt you," he said. "I'll do whatever it takes." "I know, but Maxim, I'm not helpless. I survived years of invisibility and poverty and loss. I can survive this too. Trust me to stand beside you, not just behind you." "Always," he said, and kissed me again, softer this time, like a promise instead of a claim. The war with Dmitri shifted from open conflict to strategic maneuvering. Maxim restructured his business, moving assets into legitimate holdings, cutting ties with associates who operated too far into the gray. It cost him in the short term, lost contracts, reduced profits, but it hardened his position against regulatory scrutiny. I worked beside him through all of it, translating documents and sitting in meetings where lawyers and accountants spoke in precise language about corporate structures and liability shields. It was boring and crucial in equal measure, and I learned more about legitimate business practices in 2 weeks than I'd learned in my entire previous life. But Dmitri was patient and creative. He couldn't attack Maxim's operations directly anymore, so he went after reputation instead. Whisper campaigns about criminal connections, leaked documents taken out of context, strategic questions posed to journalists at events where Maxim was trying to build legitimate partnerships. "He's trying to isolate you," Stefania observed during one of our strategy sessions. "Make you radioactive to potential legitimate partners. If you can't go straight, you'll have to stay in the gray areas where he can still hurt you." "So we counter with transparency," Maxim said. "Open books, full audits, voluntary cooperation with regulators. Make it clear we have nothing to hide because there's nothing to find." "That's a risk," Victor pointed out. "Full transparency means exposing your entire network. If Dmitri finds a single thread to pull." "He won't, because Elena and Stefania are going through everything first, flagging anything that could be misinterpreted, restructuring before we open the books." Maxim looked at me. "It's going to be brutal work. Long hours, intense scrutiny. Are you up for it?" "Yes," I said simply. We worked 12-hour days for 3 weeks straight, combing through years of records, contracts, transaction histories. Clara brought food and coffee at regular intervals, and Victor maintained security, but mostly it was just Maxim, Stefania, and me in a conference room surrounded by documents, and the weight of building something legitimate from foundations that had always been slightly questionable. I learned things about Maxim during those weeks, how he took responsibility for every mistake his associates made, even when it wasn't technically his fault, how he paid his people generously and never asked them to cross lines he wouldn't cross himself, how the logistics empire had started as his father's attempt to help people like my grandparents escape situations they shouldn't have been in, and how Maxim had inherited both the operation and the complicated morality that came with it. "My father believed that laws weren't always just," Maxim told me one late night when we were alone in the office, everyone else gone home. "That sometimes the right thing required working outside official channels, but he also believed in limits, in lines you didn't cross. No civilians hurt, no exploitation of the vulnerable, no profit from true suffering." "You followed those rules," I said. "I've tried, but the world he built, the world I inherited, it exists in gray spaces, and eventually those gray spaces become untenable. You can't build a legacy on ambiguity, Elena. You can only build it on solid ground. So you're tearing down what your father built." "I'm evolving it, honoring the intent while changing the execution." He rubbed his eyes, exhausted. "I just hope I can do it fast enough to beat Dimitri's timeline." 2 days later, we found out Dimitri's real plan. The envelope arrived by courier, addressed to me personally at the safe house. Victor opened it first, protocol, and his expression went carefully blank when he read the contents. "You need to see this," he said, handing me a single sheet of paper. It was a photograph. Me and Maxim, outside the hospital the day he'd arranged my grandmother's care. The angle suggested surveillance, and the date stamp was from that very first night. Across the bottom, in neat handwriting, "Consider what people will think about this timeline." I understood immediately. Dmitri was going to spin a narrative, that Maxim had deliberately targeted me, that my grandmother's illness had been leveraged for coercion, that our relationship was predatory rather than genuine. In the court of public opinion, it didn't matter what was true, only what seemed plausible. Maxim's face went absolutely cold when he saw the photo. "He's escalating to personal attacks," Stefania said grimly. "This is dangerous territory if he releases this to the media." "He won't," Maxim said with absolute certainty. "Because if he does, I'll release information about his father's role in my father's death. It's not enough to prosecute, but it's enough to destroy what's left of the Volkov family name in legitimate circles. Mutually assured destruction." "So it's a stalemate," I said. "For now. But Alina," he turned to me, and I saw genuine fear in his eyes for the first time. "This means he's been watching you since the beginning. He knows where you live, where your grandmother is, your routines. We need to increase security immediately." "Or I could leave," I said quietly, "remove myself as a target." "No," the word was absolute, non-negotiable. "We're past that option. If you leave now, it looks like confirmation of whatever narrative Dmitri wants to build. We stay together and we tell our story on our terms." "What story is that?" He took my hands, held them tight. "The truth. That I met you by chance, that I needed a translator and you needed help with your grandmother's care. That what started as a business arrangement became something else because we chose it, not because I coerced it. That you're here because you want to be, not because you have to be. And if people don't believe that, then they don't, but at least we'll have told the truth." He pulled me closer, his voice dropping to something raw and honest. "I love you, Alina. I should have said it weeks ago, and I refuse to let my cousin's machinations poison what we've built." "I love you too," I said, and felt the weight of the admission settle like armor. "So we do this together. We face whatever comes and we don't flinch." "Together," he agreed, and kissed me like it was a seal on a contract more binding than anything we'd signed. We went public on our own terms. An interview with a reputable journalist, carefully orchestrated by Stefania to hit before Dmitri could release his version. I told the story simply. Chance encounter, business arrangement, genuine connection that developed over time. Maxim backed it up with documentation. The contract, the timeline, the completely separate arrangement for my grandmother's care that had been formalized in writing before we'd ever become personally involved. The journalist was skeptical but fair, and the article that ran was balanced. It didn't erase the questions, but it complicated the narrative enough that Dmitri's version would look like exactly what it was, a hit piece from a business rival. The backlash came anyway. Social media speculation, think pieces about power dynamics and coercion, accusations that I was either victim or opportunist depending on who was writing. It was brutal and public and exactly as awful as I'd anticipated. But it also brought unexpected support. Other people who'd worked for Maxim came forward, telling their stories of fair treatment and genuine respect. Clara gave an interview about working for him for 5 years without a single instance of misconduct. Even some of his business rivals, the ones who weren't Dmitri, spoke on record about his reputation for keeping his word. And through it all, Maxim stood beside me, never wavering, never suggesting I should hide or step back. He took the hits with the same steady competence he brought to everything else, and gradually the narrative shifted from scandal to something more nuanced. Complicated man in complicated business building something legitimate with woman who chose to stand with him. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't silence all the critics, but it was enough. Enough to weather the storm, enough to move forward, enough to start building on solid ground instead of constantly defending ourselves. Dmitri tried one final play. He challenged Maxim to a meeting, neutral ground, lawyers present, to settle the family business once and for all. It was theater and threat in equal measure, and I wanted Maxim to refuse. "I have to go," he said when the invitation arrived. "If I don't, it looks like fear, and I won't give him that satisfaction." "Then I'm coming with you." "Elena." "No arguments. You said we're in this together. That means I stand with you even when it's dangerous, especially then." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Together then, but we do it smart." The meeting took place in a conference room at a law firm, sterile and professional, and witnessed by enough people to prevent outright violence. Dmitri was already seated when we arrived, looking satisfied with himself in a way that set off all my alarm bells. "Cousin," he said as Maxim sat down across from him, "and the lovely Elena, how domestic." "Let's skip the performance," Maxim said coolly. "You requested this meeting. State your terms." "Simple. You dissolve your operations, transfer your remaining legitimate holdings to me, and disappear. In exchange, I'll drop all further actions against you and guarantee your safety." "In other words, you want me to give you everything and trust you not to kill me anyway. Hard pass." Dmitri's smile sharpened. "Then I'll continue to dismantle you piece by piece. Your reputation, your business, your relationships. I'll make it impossible for you to operate in any legitimate space, and eventually you'll be forced back into the gray areas where accidents happen." "You're threatening me in front of lawyers," Maxim observed mildly. "Bold." "I'm stating facts. The question is whether you're smart enough to accept the inevitable." Maxim leaned back in his chair, and something in his posture changed. Became harder, more dangerous, the veneer of civilization sliding away to reveal the man underneath. "Here are my facts, Dmitri. I have documentation of your father's involvement in my father's death. Not enough to prosecute. The statute of limitations passed years ago, but enough to destroy your family name completely. I've also uncovered some interesting patterns in your current operations, things that suggest you've been less careful about those legal gray areas than I have. And I have leverage with several of your key partners, who'd be happy to discuss restructuring their relationships if properly motivated." Dmitri's expression flickered. "You're bluffing." "Am I? We can test that theory if you'd like. But I think you'll find that I've spent the last 10 years preparing for this exact conversation. The question is whether you're smart enough to accept a different kind of inevitable." "Which is?" "Truce. We divide the territory, stay out of each other's operations, and move forward with our separate legitimate ventures. You stop attacking me and mine. I stop uncovering interesting facts about your activities. We end this before one of us ends up in prison or worse." The silence stretched. I watched Dmitri calculate, saw the moment he understood that Maxim had outmaneuvered him. "Fine," he said finally, "truce, but if you break it." "I won't. I keep my word, cousin. It's what separates us." The lawyers drew up the agreement on the spot, formal and binding, and so full of legal language it made my head hurt. But the essence was clear. Peace through mutually assured destruction. Two cousins agreeing to stop trying to kill each other's empires and maybe, eventually, trying to kill each other. We left the building into a spring afternoon that felt like possibility. "Is it really over?" I asked as we drove away. "The war with Dmitri, yes. The work of building something legitimate, that's just beginning." Maxim took my hand, laced our fingers together. "But I have everything I need to see it through. Time, resources, and you." "Me?" "You, my translator, my assistant, my partner in building something better." He brought my hand to his lips, kissed my knuckles. "If you'll have me." "For how long?" "As long as you'll stay. Years, decades, forever if I'm lucky." I thought of my grandmother saying that debt could become choice, that chains could become wings. Thought of standing invisible in La Perla Nera and then becoming suddenly, irrevocably seen. Forever sounds good, I said. My grandmother passed away in her sleep 6 months later, peacefully in her own bed with the spring sun streaming through her window. She was 87 and had lived a full life, and her last words to me were in Polish. You chose well, Kochany. Be happy. I grieved, but it was clean grief, uncomplicated by regret or things left unsaid. She died knowing I was loved and protected, that the life she'd worked so hard to give me had borne fruit. Maxim held me through the funeral and the days after, solid and steady and exactly what I needed. His business was stabilizing, moving fully legitimate, and I'd become not just his translator but his partner in the truest sense, building new ventures, forming new partnerships, creating something that could outlast us both. We married a year after Babsha died, small ceremony with just Clara and Victor and Stefania as witnesses. I wore white and pearls and felt like I was choosing rather than settling, standing beside someone who'd become my home. 5 years after that first frozen night in Milan, I stood in the office that had become ours, not just his anymore, and looked out at the city spread below. The girl who'd been invisible serving champagne felt like a different person, someone I'd grown from rather than left behind. Maxim came up behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist, rested his chin on my shoulder. Thinking, he asked. Remembering. That night you asked me to get in the car, and I was so certain I was making a terrible choice. Were you wrong? No, it was terrible and wonderful and exactly what I needed. You were what I needed, even when I didn't know I needed you. I knew, he said simply. The moment you answered that phone in Polish, I knew you were mine. It just took you a while to catch up. Arrogant, I said, but I was smiling. Confident, he corrected. There's a difference. The light was fading outside, another February evening settling over Milan, but inside it was warm. Inside I was seen and known and chosen, and I had chosen in return. From cold invisibility to this, partnership and love and the solid ground of building something that mattered. Come on, Maxim said, pulling me toward the door. Dinner reservations, and I have something for you. Another surprise. Always, I'm a patient man, Alina, but I'm not a boring one, come see. I went, laughing, into the evening and the life we'd built from chance and choice, and the strange mercy of a frozen night when everything changed. Behind us, the office lights dimmed automatically, and the city glowed like a promise kept. We'd come a long way from that first moment of visibility, that first recognition of something worth the risk. And looking at Maxim, my husband, my partner, my impossible gift, I knew we'd go even further still. Together, always together.